The candle had almost burned to nothing when the pounding started on the door. Ilara Winters dropped her needle and stood so fast the chair scraped hard against the floor. It was past midnight. No one knocked at this hour, unless something terrible had happened. She crossed the small shop in 3 steps and pulled the door open before the pounding could wake her brother upstairs. A man stood there, tall and breathing hard, his coat dusted with road dirt and his eyes wide with something close to panic. She did not know his face, but she knew his clothes. Only wealth wore fabric cut like that. "I need a wife," he said, before she could even ask his name. "By tomorrow morning, I will pay you well. I will pay your family well. I just need someone to stand beside me and say the words." Ilara stared at him. For a moment, she wondered if he was drunk, or mad, or both. But his eyes were clear, and his voice, though frantic, was steady with purpose. "You should try the tavern," she said. "Men looking for strange arrangements usually find them there." "I am not joking," he said. "My name is Alistair Thorne. I am the Duke of Ashcombe. My grandfather's will says I must be married before noon tomorrow, or the entire estate passes to my cousin. Hundreds of people depend on that land. Farmers, servants, families who have worked it for generations. If my cousin takes it, he will sell it apart piece by piece, and every one of them will lose their home." Ilara folded her arms. She had heard stories about noblemen and their strange family rules, but never one that arrived on her doorstep in the middle of the night. "Why me?" "Because your light was on," he said simply. "Because I have ridden through half the village, and every other door was dark. Because I am out of time, and out of choices." It should have sounded absurd. It should have made her laugh and shut the door. Instead, something in his voice held her still. Desperation, yes, but also honesty. He was not trying to charm her. He was simply telling the truth, because he had no time left for anything else. She thought of the shop around her, the shelves half empty, the debts stacked in a drawer she tried not to open. She thought of her brother Colin sleeping upstairs, thinner than he used to be, because she gave him the larger share of whatever they had. A duke's gold could change everything. It could save the shop. It could put real food on their table for the first time in months. But money was not what came out of her mouth first. "If I agree," she said slowly, "you must promise me something." He blinked, clearly surprised she had not asked about payment first. "Name it. Whatever happens between us, from this night forward, you will never lie to me. Not once. Not even to protect my feelings. Not even when the truth is difficult to say." She watched his face carefully. "I have been lied to before, by people who claimed it was for my own good. I would rather hear something painful and true than something kind and false." Alistair studied her for a long moment, as if trying to understand why a stranger about to receive more money than she had likely ever seen would ask for something so simple, so strange, and so difficult to promise absolutely. "You could ask for a house," he said, "jewels, a yearly allowance for the rest of your life." "I am asking for the truth," she said. "Always. That is my price." He let out a breath, and for the first time since he had arrived, some of the panic left his shoulders. "I promise," he said. "I will never lie to you. Whatever else I am, I will be honest with you." "Then I will marry you," Ilara said, and felt her own heart pound at the sound of the words leaving her mouth. They moved quickly after that, because there was no time not to. Alistair explained the terms as they walked through the dark toward the small stone chapel at the edge of the village, where he said the vicar owed him a favor large enough to open his doors before dawn. The marriage needed to be legal and witnessed before noon. After that, he said, she could live at Thorne Manor as his wife, with a household of her own, servants of her own, and enough security that she would never again lie awake wondering how to pay for bread. "And after?" she asked. "What happens once the will is satisfied?" "We will discuss that when we reach it," he said, and something in his tone told her that was as much truth as he had to offer that night. It was not a lie. It was simply all he knew. Colin woke when Ilara returned to gather a few things, her hands shaking slightly as she folded her only good dress into a bag. He sat up in bed, hair sticking in every direction, and stared at her as if she had lost her mind. "You are marrying a stranger," he said, "tonight, a man you met an hour ago." "I am marrying a duke," she said, trying to sound calmer than she felt, "who needs a wife by morning, or he loses everything his family has ever built." And in exchange, we will not starve, and you will not have to leave school to work in the mill." Colin's jaw tightened, the way it always did when he was trying not to show how frightened he was. He was 16, old enough to understand what their situation truly was, young enough to still resent it fiercely. What if he is cruel? What if this is some kind of trick? "Then I will handle it," Ilara said, though she did not entirely believe her own certainty. "But he does not seem cruel. He seems desperate. And desperate men, in my experience, tell you exactly what they need, because they have no time left to pretend otherwise." Her brother did not look convinced, but he hugged her tightly before she left, and that was enough. The chapel smelled of old wood and cold stone when they arrived. Father Whitmore, roused from his bed and wrapped in a coat over his nightshirt, looked between them with obvious confusion, but he did not refuse. Whatever debt Alistair had called in, it was enough to bring the old vicar out before sunrise without complaint. The ceremony was short. There were no flowers, no music, no gathered guests smiling from the pews, just the vicar's quiet voice reading words that bound two strangers together, and Colin standing near the back with his arms crossed, watching his sister marry a man he did not trust. When it came time to exchange vows, Ilara looked at Alistair and found herself searching his face for some sign of doubt, some flicker that would tell her this was all a mistake. She found none. He looked at her the way a drowning man looks at the shore, with a desperate kind of hope that had nowhere else to land. "I, Alistair, take you, Ilara," he said, his voice steady despite the hour, despite the strangeness of it all, "to be my wife. I promise to be honest with you, in all things, for as long as we are bound together." It was not the traditional vow. Father Whitmore glanced up, surprised, but said nothing. Ilara felt something tighten in her chest, some mixture of fear and relief she could not fully name. "I, Ilara, take you, Alistair," she said, "to be my husband. I promise to stand beside you, and to hold you to your word." The vicar pronounced them married before the sun had fully risen. Outside the chapel, the sky was turning pale gray, the first birds beginning their morning calls, utterly indifferent to the fact that two lives had just been permanently changed. Alistair helped her into his carriage, and as it pulled away from the village she had lived in her entire life, Ilara watched the small shop grow smaller behind them, its windows dark, its shelves half empty, its future no longer entirely tied to her own. "Thank you," Alistair said quietly, once the carriage had settled into a steady rhythm along the road. "I know this is not what you imagined for your life." "No," Ilara agreed, "but very little of my life has gone the way I imagined it. I have learned to adjust." He glanced at her, something like respect crossing his features. "You are not afraid of me." "I am not afraid of much anymore," she said. "Fear is a luxury for people who still have something soft left to lose." Alistair said nothing to that, but he did not look away from her either. The carriage rolled on through the gray morning light, carrying them both toward the estate that now, legally, belonged to her as much as it belonged to him. Neither of them spoke of what waited there. Neither of them yet knew about the cousin who would not accept defeat quietly, or the woman from Alistair's past who was about to return, or how quickly a marriage built on desperation could either collapse entirely or become something neither of them expected. For now, there was only the road, the early light, and the promise that had been made in the dark. A promise Ilara intended to hold him to, no matter what truths it eventually forced into the light. As the carriage crested a hill, the outline of Thorn Manor appeared in the distance, its stone towers catching the first real light of morning. Ilara felt her breath catch, not from fear this time, but from the sheer size of the life she had just stepped into. Somewhere within those walls, a cousin was likely still asleep, unaware that his claim to the estate had already slipped through his fingers sometime before dawn. Somewhere within those walls, staff would soon wake to find their master had returned with a wife none of them had ever heard of. Alistair watched her staring at the house, and felt something shift in his chest. A strange mixture of relief and uncertainty. The immediate crisis was solved. His grandfather's will would be satisfied. His cousin would not inherit. But as the carriage rolled closer to the manor gates, he realized the true difficulty was only beginning. He had promised this woman honesty, and honesty, he was beginning to understand, would be far harder to give than he had expected, especially once she began asking the questions he had hoped to avoid. He thought briefly of the letter waiting in his study, the one he had not yet opened, sent by a woman whose name he had hoped never to hear again. He thought of his cousin, who would not accept this sudden marriage without a fight, and who had never once in his life lost gracefully. There were storms ahead, he knew that much. But for the first time in weeks, sitting across from a woman who had asked for nothing but honesty, he felt something close to steady ground beneath him. The carriage passed through the tall iron gates, and the manor rose fully into view, its windows catching the early sun like rows of watching eyes. Alara straightened her shoulders, smoothed the front of her traveling dress, and reminded herself that she had survived worse mornings than this one. Whatever waited inside those doors, she intended to meet it standing, not shrinking. She had made a promise of her own, after all, and she did not intend to break it either. The manor door opened before the carriage even came to a full stop, and a tall man with graying hair and a stiff posture stepped out onto the stone steps. Grady, the butler, had clearly not slept much either, judging by the shadows under his eyes, but his expression gave nothing away as he bowed toward Alistair, and then, more slowly, toward Alara. "Your Grace," he said carefully, his eyes moving from Alistair to the woman beside him and back again, "we were not informed you would be returning with a guest." "Not a guest," Alistair said, stepping down from the carriage and offering Alara his hand. "My wife, the Duchess of Ashcombe." If Grady felt any shock at those words, he did not show it, though his eyes lingered a moment longer than politeness usually allowed. "Of course, Your Grace. Congratulations. I will inform Mrs. Pemberton at once, so a room can be prepared." "Thank you, Grady," Alistair said, and there was something in his voice, a kind of practiced calm, that told Alara this man had learned long ago to keep his household running smoothly, no matter what surprises arrived at the door. Inside, the manor was larger than anything Alara had ever stood inside. High ceilings stretched overhead, painted with faded scenes of hunting parties and pale skies. Portraits lined the hallway. Generations of Thorns staring down with the same sharp cheekbones and steady eyes Alistair had. She felt suddenly very aware of her traveling dress, worn soft at the seams, and the small bag of belongings still clutched in her hand. Mrs. Pemberton arrived within minutes, a stout woman with kind eyes but a guarded expression, the sort of person who had clearly seen many strange things happen in a house like this, and had learned not to react too quickly to any of them. She curtsied to Alara, welcomed her with careful words, and led her toward a room on the second floor that would, for now, be hers alone. "The Duke usually takes his meals in the East Study," Mrs. Pemberton explained as they walked, her tone brisk and efficient. "He does not care much for the formal dining hall unless there are guests. I imagine that will change, now that there is a duchess in the house." Alara caught something careful in the housekeeper's voice, a kind of testing, as if she were waiting to see how this new arrival would respond to the strangeness of the household. Alara simply nodded, and said she would adjust to whatever suited the house best, and something in Mrs. Pemberton's shoulders eased slightly, as though she had expected demands and received humility instead. The room prepared for her was larger than the entire upstairs of her family's shop. A wide bed sat near tall windows overlooking gardens still silver with early morning dew. Alara set her small bag on the chair near the door, and stood for a long moment simply looking at the space, trying to understand how quickly her life had turned itself inside out. She did not see Alistair again until the evening meal, and when she did, he looked different than he had the night before. Gone was the desperate, wide-eyed man who had pounded on her door in the dark. In his place stood someone composed, distant, almost formal, as though the manor itself had folded him back into an old and familiar shape the moment he crossed its threshold. "I trust your room is comfortable," he said, as a servant set dishes before them in the smaller study Mrs. Pemberton had mentioned. "It is more than comfortable," Alara said. "It is larger than anywhere I have ever slept." Something flickered across his face, gone before she could name it. Guilt, perhaps, or discomfort at the reminder of how different their lives had been before last night. "You will want for nothing here," he said instead. "I have instructed Mrs. Pemberton to see that you have whatever you need. Clothing suited to your new position. Anything else you require." "Thank you," Alara said, though the formality of his tone left something cold settling in her chest. Last night, in the dark, he had spoken to her as an equal, someone whose opinion mattered enough to shape a promise around. Tonight, He spoke to her the way a man might speak to a well-cared-for guest, polite and distant and entirely unreachable. They ate mostly in silence after that, the quiet broken only by the soft sounds of servants moving in and out of the room. Ilara found herself studying him across the table, searching for the man from the night before, wondering if he had only ever existed in the desperation of that single midnight hour. It was 2 days later when she first met Reginald. She was walking through the East Garden, still learning the shape of her new home, when she came upon a man leaning against a low stone wall, watching her approach with an expression she did not like at all. He was handsome in a sharp, calculated sort of way, his clothes as fine as Alistair's, but worn with a kind of restless energy that made her instinctively wary. "So you are the seamstress," he said, before she had even reached him. "The little village girl who saved my cousin's inheritance." "I am the Duchess of Ashcombe," Ilara said evenly, refusing to let the insult in his tone unsettle her. "And you must be Reginald." "Clever," he said, though his smile did not reach his eyes. Alistair always did prefer things that were clever rather than proper. "I suppose I should congratulate you. You managed in one night what half the eligible women in this county failed to accomplish in years." "I did not set out to accomplish anything," Ilara said. "Your cousin needed help. I gave it. And received quite a bit in return, I imagine." Reginald's eyes moved slowly over the garden, the manor, the grounds beyond, as though calculating the value of everything he saw. "Tell me, Duchess, do you know why the will demanded he marry so suddenly? Do you know what he was running from?" Ilara felt something tighten in her chest, but she kept her expression steady. "I know what he told me." "Ah," Reginald's smile sharpened. "Then you know very little at all. My cousin has a talent for telling people exactly enough truth to satisfy them, while leaving out everything that actually matters. You would do well to remember that, before you grow too comfortable in that room upstairs." He walked away before she could respond, leaving her standing alone in the garden with his words settling uncomfortably in her stomach. She thought of the promise Alistair had made, the one she had demanded before agreeing to any of this. He had sworn never to lie to her. But Reginald's words carried a different warning entirely, one about truths withheld rather than lies spoken outright, and the difference between the two felt suddenly very important. That evening, she found Alistair alone in his study, a room lined with books and lit by a low fire despite the mild weather outside. He looked up when she entered, surprised, since she had not sought him out privately since their arrival. "I met your cousin today," she said, closing the door behind her. Something shifted in his expression, wariness replacing the polite composure he usually wore. "I imagine that was unpleasant. He said you have a talent for telling people just enough truth to satisfy them, while leaving out everything that actually matters." She watched his face carefully. "He said I should be careful, before growing too comfortable here." Alistair set down the papers he had been reviewing, and rubbed a hand over his face, a gesture that made him look suddenly tired, older than his years. "Reginald says many things designed to unsettle people. It is one of his particular skills." "Is he wrong?" Ilara asked, stepping closer to the desk. "You promised me honesty, Alistair. Not comfortable half-truths, not careful silences. Honesty. So I am asking you directly, is there something you have not told me?" For a long moment, he said nothing, and the silence stretched thin enough that Ilara felt her stomach drop, certain she already knew the answer before he spoke it. "There is a woman," he said finally, quietly, as though the words cost him something to release. "Her name is Vivienne. We were engaged, several years ago, before circumstances forced the arrangement to end. My grandfather never trusted her. He believed, correctly as it turned out, that she cared more for the title than for me. The marriage clause in his will was not simply about continuing the family line. It was designed, quite specifically, to keep me from ever marrying her, by forcing my hand toward someone else before she could convince me otherwise." Ilara absorbed this slowly, feeling several things at once. Relief, that he had not technically lied to her, since none of this had come up in their brief exchange that first night. But also a sharper feeling, something closer to hurt, that he had allowed her to walk into this house without preparing her for the shadows already waiting inside it. "You should have told me this before the wedding," she said. "I know," Alistair admitted, and there was no defensiveness in his voice, only tired honesty. There was no time that night to explain everything, and I told myself the details did not matter as long as the marriage was legal by morning. But you are right. You deserve to know the whole shape of what you were agreeing to, not just the urgent piece of it. Is she still nearby, this Vivian? Alistair hesitated, and that hesitation told Ilara more than words could have. She has a home in the county, yes. It is possible our paths will cross eventually. Society here is small, and gatherings are frequent. Ilara nodded slowly, turning this new information over in her mind. She was not angry, not exactly, though something wary had settled into her chest that had not been there before. What troubled her most was not the existence of Vivian, but the reminder that Alistair, even now, even after his promise, still seemed to believe some truths were better left unspoken until directly demanded. I need you to understand something, she said, meeting his eyes steadily. I did not ask for your promise because I enjoy uncomfortable conversations. I asked because I have spent my whole life around people who decided, on my behalf, which truths I was strong enough to hear. I do not need protecting from difficult information, Alistair. I need honesty, freely given, not honesty pulled out of you only when someone else forces the subject. He studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that had not been there before. You are right, but we'll do better. I promise you that as well. It was not a large moment, not compared to everything still waiting ahead of them, but something changed between them that evening in the quiet study. The distance that had settled over Alistair since their arrival at the manor began, slowly, to soften, and Ilara, standing there with her arms crossed and her chin lifted, understood for the first time that holding him to his promise would require constant vigilance, not a single demand made once and then forgotten. Outside the study window, the last light of evening faded over the gardens where Reginald had stood earlier that day, watching her with calculating eyes, already turning over plans of his own. Neither Ilara nor Alistair could see him from where they sat, but somewhere in the manor, his footsteps moved quietly through the halls, gathering information, waiting for the right moment to use it. In the days that followed, Ilara began to find her footing within the manor's strange rhythms. She learned the names of the staff, one by one, starting with the youngest maid, a girl named Poppy who blushed every time she was addressed directly, and ending with old Mr. Finch, who tended the gardens and spoke more easily to his roses than to people. She found that kindness, offered plainly and without condescension, opened doors that money alone never could have managed. Within a week, the staff no longer watched her with open suspicion. Some had even begun to smile when she passed. Alistair noticed the change as well, though he said little about it directly. He watched from across rooms as she charmed the household not through grand gestures but through simple attention, remembering small details about people's lives that even he, who had grown up among these same servants, had somehow overlooked. It unsettled him slightly, this quiet competence she carried, because it reminded him how little he had actually known about the woman he married in such haste. One afternoon, he found her in the sewing room that had once belonged to his mother, a space long unused, its shelves gathering dust. She had opened the windows to let in fresh air, and was carefully examining a pile of old fabric scraps, her fingers moving with the same practiced ease he had first noticed the night they met. "You do not have to work," he said from the doorway, startling her slightly. "There is no need. The estate can afford whatever you require, without your hands ever touching a needle again." Ilara looked up at him, an eyebrow raised. "I did not ask whether I needed to work, Alistair. I asked whether I wanted to. There is a difference. My hands do not know how to sit idle, and I have little interest in learning that particular skill now, simply because circumstances have changed." He leaned against the doorframe, something like amusement crossing his features for the first time since they had arrived. "Reginald will find that terribly unfashionable, a duchess with calluses on her fingers." "Reginald," Ilara said dryly, "can find whatever he likes." The comment drew an actual laugh from Alistair, quiet and brief, but genuine, and Ilara felt something warm settle in her chest at the sound of it. It was the first time she had heard him laugh since the night they met, and she found herself wanting to hear it again. That evening, as they walked together through the manor's long gallery, lit by rows of flickering candles, Alistair spoke more freely than he had since bringing her home. He told her about his grandfather, a stern but fair man who had raised him after his own parents died when he was young, He told her about summers spent exploring the estate's furthest fields, about the weight of a title he had never particularly wanted, but had never known how to refuse. Alara listened carefully, storing away each piece of him, understanding that trust, like fine fabric, had to be woven slowly, thread by careful thread, or it would never hold its shape under pressure. By the time they reached the end of the gallery, something had shifted between them, subtle but undeniable. The marriage that had begun as a desperate bargain in the dark was beginning, slowly and carefully, to become something else entirely, though neither of them yet had the words to name exactly what that something was. The invitation arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by a footman in livery. Alara did not recognize, sent from a manor 3 miles north known as Ashford Hall. She was in the breakfast room when Grady brought it in on a silver tray, and she noticed the way his expression tightened slightly as he set it before Alistair. Alistair broke the seal, read the contents quickly, and his jaw tightened in a way Alara had come to recognize over the past 2 weeks, as a sign of trouble. "What is it?" she asked. "A garden party," he said, setting the letter down carefully, as though it might bite him. "Hosted by Lady Vivian Ashford. She has invited the entire county, myself included, and she has specifically requested that I bring my new wife." Alara felt a small chill settle over her, though she kept her expression steady. "She knows about our marriage already?" "News travels quickly among people with nothing better to occupy their time," Alistair said grimly. "I imagine half the county has heard the story by now, embellished in a dozen different ways. Do we have to attend?" "Refusing would be seen as an admission of weakness," Alistair said. "Reginald would use it against us, and Vivian would take it as proof that I am still avoiding her, which would only encourage her further. No, we attend, and we do so together, and we give her nothing to work with." Alara studied him carefully. "You are afraid of her." "I am wary of her," Alistair corrected, though the distinction seemed thin even to his own ears. "Vivian has a talent for making people believe things that are not entirely true, myself included, once upon a time. I do not intend to give her that opportunity again." The garden party arrived 3 days later, under a sky so clear and blue, it seemed almost mocking, given the tension coiled tight in Alara's stomach, as their carriage approached Ashford Hall. The grounds were immaculate, dotted with white pavilions and long tables set with more silver and crystal than Alara had seen in her entire life combined. Guests in fine clothing moved between conversations with practiced ease, their laughter light and performative, the kind of laughter that existed mainly to be seen and heard by others. Vivian found them within minutes of their arrival, gliding across the lawn in a gown the color of deep wine, her dark hair arranged in careful curls that had clearly taken hours to achieve. She was beautiful in a sharp, deliberate way, every feature calculated for maximum effect, and Alara understood immediately why a younger Alistair might have found himself captivated. "Alistair," Vivian said warmly, extending both hands as though greeting an old friend, rather than a man who had once been engaged to her before circumstances tore them apart. "It has been far too long. You look wonderful." "Vivian," Alistair said, his voice carefully neutral. "Allow me to introduce my wife, Alara." Vivian's eyes moved to Alara with a slowness that felt deliberate, assessing every detail from her hairstyle to the cut of her borrowed gown. "The seamstress," she said, her tone pleasant, but with an edge beneath it that only someone paying close attention would catch. "How delightfully unconventional of you, Alistair. I confess I never expected you to marry someone quite so practical." "Alara has many talents beyond her former profession," Alistair said evenly, his hand finding the small of Alara's back in a gesture that felt protective rather than performative. "I find myself continually surprised by them." "I am sure you do," Vivian said, her smile never wavering. "Well, I do hope you will both enjoy the party. There is so much to see, and so many old friends eager to meet the woman who managed to accomplish what none of the rest of us could." She drifted away toward another cluster of guests, and Alara felt the tension in her shoulders ease only slightly once the distance between them had grown. "She is exactly as unpleasant as I expected," Alara said quietly. Alistair let out a short breath that was almost a laugh. "She has that effect on most people, though few are brave enough to say it aloud." They moved through the party together, and Alara found herself the subject of careful, curious glances from every direction, guests clearly trying to determine what to make of the Duke's sudden and unconventional marriage. She held her chin high and answered every question with steady confidence, refusing to let the whispered comments or sideways glances shake her composure. It was nearly an hour later, while Alistair had been pulled aside by an old family friend eager to discuss estate matters, that Alara found herself alone near the edge of the garden, and Reginald appeared beside her as though summoned by her solitude. "Enjoying the party, Duchess?" "Immensely," Alara said dryly. Reginald smiled, unbothered by her tone. "I spoke with Vivian earlier. She finds you quite fascinating. A seamstress, elevated overnight to a duchess. It is the sort of story that captures imaginations, is it not? Though I imagine some might wonder how a shop girl managed to be in exactly the right place, at exactly the right moment, when a desperate duke needed a wife by morning." Something in his tone made Alara go still. "What are you implying?" "Nothing at all," Reginald said smoothly. "Merely observing that fortune has a curious way of favoring certain people at certain times. Tell me, Duchess, did your family's shop truly fail through simple misfortune? Or was there perhaps something else at work, some difficulty that arrived rather conveniently, right around the time my cousin found himself desperately searching for a bride?" Alara's stomach dropped, cold dread pooling where confidence had stood only moments before. "Our shop failed because business was difficult, and debts accumulated faster than we could manage them. There was nothing convenient about watching my brother go hungry." "Of course," Reginald said, though his eyes said he believed nothing of the sort. "I only mention it because I have always found coincidences worth examining closely. Perhaps you should examine your own circumstances a bit more carefully, before growing too settled in your new position. Fortunes that arrive suddenly have a way of disappearing just as quickly." He walked away before she could respond, leaving her standing alone near the garden's edge, his words circling in her mind like something poisonous. She thought of the months leading up to that midnight knock on her door, the slow decline of her family's shop, customers who had once been loyal suddenly finding reasons to take their business elsewhere. She had assumed it was simply misfortune, the natural result of difficult times. But Reginald's words planted a seed of doubt she could not easily uproot. She did not mention the conversation to Alistair until they were back in the carriage, the party fading behind them, the sky beginning to darken toward evening. "Reginald suggested something troubling today," she said, watching his face carefully as she spoke. "He implied that my family's shop did not fail through simple misfortune. He suggested someone may have deliberately caused our difficulties, timed conveniently around your search for a bride." Alistair's expression shifted immediately, concern replacing the relaxed satisfaction of having survived the party without major incident. "That is a serious accusation. Is it possible?" Alara asked. "Is it possible someone connected to your family had a reason to want my shop to fail, to leave me vulnerable enough to accept a stranger's proposal without hesitation?" Alistair was quiet for a long moment, turning the question over carefully before answering. "I do not know," he said finally, and Alara appreciated, even in her worry, that he did not offer false reassurance simply to comfort her. "But I intend to find out. If Reginald is hinting at something, it is likely because he already knows more than he is saying, and enjoys watching people squirm beneath the weight of half-revealed secrets. Why would he do this? What does he gain by making me suspicious?" "Reginald gains satisfaction from chaos," Alistair said grimly. "If he can make you doubt your own circumstances, doubt me, doubt the foundation of our marriage, he creates cracks he can later widen. He lost the estate once already. He will not accept that loss quietly, and he is patient enough to wait for the right moment to strike again." Alara looked out the carriage window at the darkening countryside, her mind turning over Reginald's words alongside Alistair's explanation, trying to separate genuine concern from deliberate manipulation. "I need to write to my brother," she said finally. "Colin still lives near the shop. If something happened deliberately, he may know details I never noticed, distracted as I was by simply trying to keep us fed." "I will have a letter sent first thing tomorrow," Alistair promised. "And Alara, whatever we discover, I want you to know that none of this changes anything between us. If someone manipulated your circumstances to force your hand, the fault lies with them, not with you." Alara appreciated the sentiment, but something cold had settled into her chest that his words could not entirely dissolve. If Reginald was right, if her family's ruin had been engineered deliberately, then the very foundation of her marriage, the desperate midnight bargain she had believed was simple chance, had actually been something else entirely: manufactured circumstance. A trap she had walked into believing she was making a free choice. The letter to Colin was sent the following morning, and the days that followed passed with an uneasy tension neither Alara nor Alistair fully acknowledged aloud. She continued her work in the sewing room, continued learning the household's rhythms, but found herself watching the staff more carefully now, wondering if any of them might know something relevant, wondering how deep Reginald's schemes might actually reach. It was during this period of watchful waiting that Alara began noticing something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with Reginald or Vivian or the manufactured circumstances of her marriage. She began noticing the way Alistair sought her out more frequently, finding small excuses to walk with her through the gardens, to sit near her in the evenings, even when official business did not require it. She began noticing the way his eyes lingered when he thought she was not watching, something warm and uncertain flickering behind his careful composure. One evening, nearly a week after the garden party, she found him standing alone on the manor's east terrace, looking out over grounds silvered by moonlight. She joined him without a word, and for a long moment, they simply stood together in comfortable silence, watching the wind move through the distant trees. "I have been thinking about something," Alistair said eventually, his voice quieter than usual. "When you asked for my promise that first night, you said you had been lied to before, by people who claimed it was for your own good. I never asked who." Alara was quiet for a moment, surprised by the question, surprised that he had remembered that particular detail from a conversation held in such desperate, hurried circumstances. "My father," she said finally. "He told my mother, for years, that our finances were secure, that there was nothing to worry about, even as debts quietly accumulated behind closed doors. When he died, we discovered the truth all at once, with no warning, no time to prepare. My mother never recovered from the shock of it. She passed within the year, and Colin and I were left to manage what remained of the shop, and the debts he had hidden so carefully." "I am sorry," Alistair said quietly. "That explains a great deal about why honesty matters so much to you." "It is not simply about honesty," Alara said, turning to face him fully. "It is about respect. When someone hides the truth from you, even with good intentions, they are deciding, on your behalf, that you are not strong enough to handle reality. My father believed he was protecting my mother. Instead, he left her utterly unprepared for the very thing he claimed to be shielding her from." Alistair absorbed this, something shifting visibly behind his eyes. "I understand now, more fully than I did before, why my silence about Vivian troubled you so deeply, even though nothing I said was technically false." "Withholding truth can be its own kind of lie," Alara said softly. "Even when every individual word spoken is accurate." They stood together on the terrace a while longer, the distance between them narrowing slowly, not through any single dramatic gesture, but through the quiet accumulation of honest moments, each one building trust where suspicion and desperation had once stood alone. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the manor's grounds, Reginald continued his careful plotting, and Vivian nursed her own wounded pride, and the letter to Colin traveled slowly toward its destination, carrying with it answers that would soon change everything Alara believed she understood about the night her whole life had shifted course. What Alara did not see, and could not have known, was the meeting taking place that same evening, in a small parlor at Ashford Hall, several miles from where she stood on the terrace with Alistair. Vivian sat near the fire, a glass of wine untouched in her hand, while Reginald paced slowly before her, his restless energy filling the room. "She is more resilient than I expected," Reginald said, frustration edging his voice. "I thought a few pointed comments would send her running back to whatever village hovel she crawled out of. Instead, she seems to be settling in rather comfortably." "You underestimate desperation," Vivian said coolly, finally taking a slow sip of her wine. "A woman who has known genuine hunger does not frighten easily over a few unkind words. You will need something sharper than implication if you hope to dislodge her." "And you?" Reginald asked, turning to face her fully. "I noticed you did not seem particularly frightened either, standing there at the party, smiling as though nothing at all troubled you." I have had years of practice concealing my feelings, Vivian said, though something brittle flashed briefly behind her composed expression. Alistair was meant to be mine. That will was designed specifically to keep us apart. And yet here we are, still circling one another, still unable to simply walk away. Then help me, Reginald said, sitting across from her, his voice dropping into something more urgent. Help me find a way to unravel this marriage, and I promise you, once the estate returns to my control, I will ensure you have every opportunity to reclaim what you believe is rightfully yours. Vivian studied him for a long moment, calculating, weighing the offer against her own considerable pride. What did you find, regarding her family's shop? Reginald's smile turned sharp. Enough to be useful. A merchant who supplied her family with fabric suddenly stopped extending credit, right around the time their debts began accumulating too quickly to manage. That merchant, as it happens, owed my late uncle a significant favor, one I have recently discovered how to call in myself. You arranged it, Vivian said, something like admiration crossing her features. You engineered her family's ruin. I merely accelerated an inevitability, Reginald said dismissively. Their shop was struggling long before I became involved. I simply ensured the collapse arrived at a moment that might prove useful, in case my cousin ever found himself in need of a convenient, desperate bride, willing to overlook his family's difficult history. You could not have known he would actually marry her. No, Reginald admitted. That particular development exceeded even my expectations. But it hardly matters now. What matters is ensuring she discovers the truth in a manner that destroys whatever fragile trust has begun forming between them, rather than in a manner that draws them closer together through shared adversity. Vivian considered this carefully. And how do you propose accomplishing that? The upcoming ball, Reginald said, leaning forward. Alistair is hosting it in 3 weeks, to formally introduce his new Duchess to society. It will be the perfect setting. If we can arrange for the truth to emerge publicly, dramatically, in front of the entire county, her humiliation will be complete, and Alistair will be forced to choose between defending a woman whose entire marriage was built on manufactured desperation, or abandoning her to preserve his own reputation. And you believe he will abandon her? Reginald's smile widened. I believe pride is a powerful force, Vivian, one you understand better than most. Faced with public humiliation, even the most devoted husband might hesitate. And hesitation, in front of enough witnesses, will be all the opening we need. Vivian set down her wineglass slowly, something calculating settling behind her eyes. 3 weeks, she said. That should be sufficient time to prepare everything properly. They continued planning late into the night, unaware that Ilara's letter to her brother had already begun its journey, carrying questions that would eventually lead Colin to uncover fragments of the very truth Reginald believed he alone controlled. Fortune, as it turned out, was not entirely on the side of those who plotted in shadows, though neither Reginald nor Vivian yet understood how quickly their careful scheme would begin unraveling once honest people started asking honest questions. Back at Thorn Manor, Ilara remained unaware of the conversation taking place miles away, unaware of the ball being planned as a stage for her potential downfall, unaware that the very foundation of her marriage was about to be tested, in ways far more dramatic than a few pointed comments in a garden. She only knew that something had shifted between herself and Alistair that evening on the terrace, something honest and fragile, and worth protecting, whatever storms might be gathering on the horizon. Colin's reply arrived 11 days later, delivered by a rider who had clearly pushed his horse hard to make the journey quickly. Ilara tore open the seal in the privacy of her sewing room, her hands trembling slightly as she unfolded the pages, dense with her brother's careful handwriting. He had done more than she expected. In the days since receiving her letter, Colin had visited every merchant who once supplied their family's shop, asking careful questions, piecing together a pattern that had escaped Ilara entirely during those exhausting final months. One merchant, after considerable hesitation and a promise of discretion, had finally admitted the truth. He had stopped extending credit to their family, not because of any genuine business concern, but because a man named Reginald Thorn had called in an old family debt, demanding the merchant cut ties with the Winters shop immediately, regardless of the consequences. Colin had gone further still, tracking down 2 other suppliers who told similar stories, each one describing sudden, unexplained pressure to abandon their business relationship with the shop, arriving suspiciously close together, timed in a way that could not reasonably be explained by simple coincidence. He had even managed to obtain a written statement from the first merchant, signed and dated, describing exactly what Reginald had demanded and why. Ilara read the letter twice, her stomach twisting tighter with each pass through the details. Everything Reginald had implied at the garden party was true, but far worse than implication. He had deliberately, methodically destroyed her family's livelihood, not through random misfortune, but through calculated pressure applied specifically to leave her vulnerable, isolated, and desperate enough to accept whatever arrangement came her way. She sat with the letter for a long time, feeling something complicated settle over her. Grief for the difficult months she now understood had been engineered rather than simply endured, and fury at a man who had treated her family's survival as nothing more than a tool in his own scheme for power. But beneath the grief and fury, she also felt something unexpected: relief. Whatever manipulation Reginald had orchestrated, it did not change the truth of what had happened between herself and Alistair that first midnight, the honest desperation in his voice, the honest vow they had exchanged. Reginald may have engineered the circumstances that brought her to that door, but he had not engineered what grew between them afterward. That part, at least, remained genuinely her own. She found Alistair in his study that evening, reviewing correspondence related to the upcoming ball, and she set Colin's letter down on the desk before him without a word. He read it slowly, his expression darkening with each line, and by the time he finished, his hands had curled into fists against the desk's polished surface. "He did this," Alistair said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "He deliberately destroyed your family's shop to leave you vulnerable enough to accept a stranger's proposal." "It appears so," Ilara said, keeping her own voice steady despite the storm of emotion still churning beneath her composure. "Your cousin is more thorough in his cruelty than I gave him credit for." Alistair stood abruptly, pacing the length of the study, his movements sharp with barely restrained fury. "This changes everything. I need to speak with him directly. I need to understand exactly what he hoped to gain, beyond simple cruelty." "Wait," Ilara said, reaching out to stop him before he could storm from the room. Confronting him directly gives him warning, gives him time to prepare defenses, or destroy evidence. We need to think carefully about how to use this information, not simply react to our anger in the moment. Alistair stopped, forcing himself to breathe slowly, and Ilara watched him visibly work to regain his composure. "You are right," he admitted after a moment. "I apologize. It is simply difficult to remain calm, knowing what he did to your family, knowing he treated your survival as nothing more than a convenient tool for his own ambitions." "I understand the anger," Ilara said gently. "I feel it too. But anger acted upon too quickly rarely accomplishes what careful strategy can achieve instead." They spent the remainder of the evening discussing options, weighing the value of confronting Reginald privately against the risk of exposing him publicly, where his cruelty could be witnessed by the entire county rather than dismissed as simple family disagreement. Alistair favored immediate confrontation, his protective instincts pulling hard against patience. Ilara counseled waiting, gathering additional evidence if possible, choosing the right moment for maximum effect, rather than allowing anger to dictate hasty action. It was during this conversation that Ilara mentioned, almost as an afterthought, the ball planned for 3 weeks hence. "The entire county will be present," she said slowly, an idea beginning to form. "If Reginald believes he still holds secret knowledge over us, knowledge he can reveal at a moment of his choosing to cause maximum damage, he may attempt something dramatic at the ball itself, expecting us to be unprepared." Alistair's eyes sharpened with understanding. "You believe we should let him think his secret remains hidden, allow him to attempt whatever public humiliation he has planned, and then reveal that we already know the full truth, undermining his plan before it can succeed." "Something like that," Ilara said, "though I confess, I do not yet know exactly how such a confrontation should unfold. We have 3 weeks to prepare, and I intend to use every remaining day carefully." Over the following days, Ilara found herself thinking constantly about the ball, about Reginald's likely intentions, about the best way to transform his planned humiliation into his own undoing. She also found herself watching Alistair more closely, noticing the way his anger toward his cousin had, if anything, drawn him closer to her, rather than creating the distance she might have expected from a man discovering his wife's misfortune, had been deliberately engineered. One afternoon, walking together through the gardens where she had first encountered Reginald's calculated cruelty, Alistair stopped suddenly and turned to face her directly. "I need to tell you something," he said, his expression serious. "Something I should have said before now, though circumstances kept interrupting the right moment." Elara felt her stomach tighten, old habits of bracing for difficult news rising automatically. "What is it?" "When I first arrived at your door that night, desperate and out of options, I saw you simply as a solution to an urgent problem. I will not pretend otherwise, since you deserve nothing less than complete honesty. But somewhere in these past weeks, watching you navigate a world entirely foreign to you, with more grace and courage than most people born into it ever manage, watching you demand honesty from me and hold me accountable to it, even when the truth was uncomfortable, I stopped seeing you as a solution to a problem, and started seeing you simply as someone I did not want to imagine my life without." Elara stood still, absorbing his words carefully, searching his face for any sign of performance or calculation, and finding none. Just honest vulnerability, the same quality that had convinced her to trust him that first desperate midnight. "I did not expect to feel this way either," she admitted quietly. "I agreed to this marriage, believing it would remain simply an arrangement, a practical solution benefiting us both. I did not anticipate that practicality would slowly become something else entirely." "And now?" Alistair asked, something hopeful and uncertain flickering behind his careful composure. "Now," Elara said, stepping closer, "I find myself grateful, despite everything Reginald engineered, despite the pain hidden beneath our beginning, that fortune, however manipulated, still led me to your door that night." Alistair reached for her hand, and she let him take it, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that felt entirely different from the formal courtesies they had exchanged during those first distant days at the manor. Whatever storms Reginald and Vivienne were preparing, whatever public humiliation waited 3 weeks hence at the ball, Elara found herself facing the approaching confrontation with something she had not expected to feel: genuine hope, rooted not in naive optimism, but in the steady, growing trust between herself and the man she had married in desperation, and was slowly, carefully, coming to love in truth. That evening, she wrote a second letter to Colin, asking him to travel to the manor before the ball, bringing with him the signed statements he had gathered, and anything else he could uncover about Reginald's involvement in their family's ruin. If they were going to expose his cruelty publicly, they would need every piece of evidence available, presented with enough clarity and force that no one in attendance could dismiss it as simple family squabbling. Colin's response arrived within days, confirming he would travel to the manor as requested, bringing with him not only the merchant statements, but additional information he had uncovered since his previous letter, details he preferred to share in person rather than risk in written correspondence that might be intercepted. As the ball drew closer, tension settled over Thorn Manor like a held breath, everyone sensing that something significant approached, though only Elara and Alistair understood exactly what shape that confrontation would eventually take. Mrs. Pemberton oversaw preparations with her usual brisk efficiency, unaware of the deeper currents moving beneath the surface of routine party planning. Grady managed guest lists and seating arrangements with careful precision, equally unaware that the evening he was organizing would become something far more dramatic than any ball the manor had hosted in recent memory. And somewhere at Ashford Hall, Reginald and Vivienne continued their own preparations, confident in their careful scheme, unaware that the very foundation of their plan, Elara's supposed ignorance of the truth behind her family's ruin, had already crumbled entirely, replaced instead by careful, patient preparation for a confrontation they believed they alone controlled. Colin arrived at Thorn Manor 4 days before the ball, his young face set with a seriousness that made him look older than his 16 years. Elara embraced him tightly the moment he stepped down from the carriage, relief flooding through her at the sight of her brother safe and well after weeks of separation. "You look well," she said, studying his face carefully. "Better fed than when I left." "The Duke's allowance has been generous," Colin admitted, glancing toward Alistair, who stood a respectful distance away, allowing the siblings a moment of private reunion. "I have used it carefully, as you instructed, but I confess, It has made the past weeks considerably easier than the months before them. Alistair stepped forward then, extending his hand toward the younger man. Colin, thank you for coming, and for everything you uncovered. Your sister has told me how thorough your investigation proved to be. Colin shook his hand, though his expression remained guarded, evaluating this stranger who had married his sister so suddenly and dramatically changed the course of both their lives. I did what needed doing, he said simply. Ilara has spent her entire life protecting me. It seemed only fair that I finally return the favor when the opportunity presented itself. They spent that evening in Alistair's study, reviewing everything Colin had gathered. Beyond the merchant statements confirming Reginald's involvement, Colin had also discovered correspondence between Reginald and a local moneylender, revealing that Reginald had personally covered the debts he encouraged merchants to call in early, essentially purchasing the leverage needed to force the shop's collapse at a moment of his choosing. It was damning evidence, methodical and undeniable, painting a clear picture of calculated cruelty rather than simple opportunism. This is more than enough, Alistair said, reviewing the final document with grim satisfaction. Presented properly, before the right witnesses, this will destroy any credibility Reginald hopes to maintain within the county. What exactly do you plan to do at the ball? Colin asked, looking between his sister and her husband with obvious curiosity. Ilara and Alistair exchanged a glance, months of careful planning condensed into that single shared look. Reginald believes he holds a secret weapon, Ilara explained. He plans to reveal the truth about the shop's collapse publicly, hoping to humiliate me and create doubt about the legitimacy of our marriage. We intend to let him believe his plan proceeds exactly as intended, right up until the moment we reveal that we already possess complete proof of his own involvement, transforming his planned humiliation into his own public downfall instead. Colin's expression shifted from concern to something like admiration. That is remarkably clever. Your sister's idea, Alistair said, glancing toward Ilara with open pride. I wanted simply to confront him directly and be done with it. She convinced me that patience would accomplish far more than immediate anger ever could. The following days passed in careful preparation, rehearsing exactly how the confrontation should unfold, ensuring every piece of evidence was properly organized and ready for presentation at precisely the right moment. Ilara found herself growing more confident with each passing day, the fear that had initially accompanied Reginald's threats gradually transforming into steady, controlled determination. On the evening before the ball, she stood in her room, examining the gown Mrs. Pemberton had commissioned for the occasion, a deep blue silk that caught the candlelight beautifully. Alistair found her there, knocking softly before entering, and for a long moment they simply stood together, looking at the dress that would carry her through tomorrow's confrontation. Are you frightened? He asked quietly. A little, Ilara admitted, but less frightened than I was when Reginald first spoke to me in the garden. Knowing the truth, even a difficult truth, is always less frightening than uncertainty. I learned that lesson from my father's silence, and I do not intend to forget it now. Alistair reached for her hand, his thumb tracing gently across her knuckles. Whatever happens tomorrow, know that I stand with you completely. Reginald may have engineered the desperate circumstances that first brought us together, but everything that has grown between us since then belongs entirely to us, not to his manipulations. I know, Ilara said softly, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she truly believed it. Outside her window, the manor's grounds lay quiet under a rising moon, preparations for tomorrow's ball already visible in the carefully arranged pavilions and strings of lanterns waiting to be lit. Tomorrow, the careful scheme Reginald and Vivian had spent weeks constructing would finally meet the truth Ilara and Alistair had spent equal weeks preparing to reveal. Whatever the outcome, Ilara understood that she would face it, not as the desperate, vulnerable seamstress who had once opened her door to a stranger's midnight plea, but as a duchess who had earned her place through courage, honesty, and hard-won trust, standing firmly beside a husband who had finally learned to give her the complete truth she had asked for from the very beginning. The ballroom at Thorn Manor blazed with candlelight, hundreds of flames reflected in polished mirrors and crystal chandeliers until the entire room seemed to shimmer. Guests arrived in a steady stream throughout the evening, their carriages lining the long drive, their voices blending into a constant hum of anticipation as word spread that this particular gathering promised more than simple dancing and refreshment. Ilara stood at the top of the grand staircase beside Alistair, her deep blue gown catching the light as she surveyed the crowd below. She had faced difficult moments before, hungry nights and grieving mornings, and the terrifying uncertainty of a stranger's midnight proposal, but nothing had quite prepared her for the particular pressure of descending into a room full of people who had come, at least in part, hoping to witness her downfall. "Ready?" Alistair asked quietly, his arm steady beneath her hand. "As I will ever be," Ilara replied, and together they descended into the glittering room below. The evening proceeded normally at first, dancing and conversation flowing with practiced ease among the assembled guests. Ilara moved through the crowd with careful composure, answering questions about her background with calm honesty rather than embarrassment, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of watching her flinch from her own history. She noticed Vivian circulating among small groups, her expression carrying a barely concealed anticipation, and she noticed Reginald watching the evening's progress with the patient satisfaction of a man who believed his careful trap remained perfectly set. It happened just after midnight, during a lull between dances, when Reginald stepped into the center of the room and raised his voice loud enough to draw the attention of every guest present. "Friends," he announced, his tone carrying false warmth that immediately silenced nearby conversations. "Before the evening continues, I believe there is something the assembled company deserves to know regarding our new Duchess and the truly remarkable circumstances that brought her into this family." Ilara felt the room's attention shift toward her, dozens of curious faces turning in her direction. Beside her, Alistair went very still, his hand tightening slightly around hers, though his expression remained carefully neutral, giving nothing away. "It seems our Duchess arrived at her fortune rather conveniently," Reginald continued, his voice carrying easily through the suddenly quiet room. "Her family's shop, you see, collapsed rather suddenly, leaving her desperate enough to accept a stranger's midnight proposal without hesitation. One might almost call the timing remarkable, arriving exactly when my cousin found himself in most urgent need of a bride." Whispers rippled through the crowd, exactly as Reginald had clearly hoped. Ilara kept her expression steady, feeling Alistair's hand still firm around hers, both of them waiting for the moment they had carefully prepared for. "What are you suggesting, cousin?" Alistair asked, his voice calm and carrying, drawing every eye toward the two men now facing each other across the crowded room. "Merely that fortune sometimes requires assistance to arrive precisely when needed," Reginald said, his smile sharp with satisfaction. "Though I suppose the true question is whether our new Duchess herself understood the convenient nature of her family's misfortune, or whether she too was simply another piece moved carefully into place." The implication hung heavy in the room, guests exchanging uncertain glances, unsure exactly what accusation Reginald intended to level. Ilara felt the moment stretch, felt every eye in the room waiting for her reaction, and she stepped forward calmly, releasing Alistair's hand to stand independently before the assembled crowd. "You are correct, Reginald," she said, her voice clear and steady enough to carry through the entire silent room. "My family's shop did not fail through simple misfortune. It failed because someone deliberately, methodically destroyed it, pressuring our merchants to withdraw credit and support, leaving us with no choice but desperate circumstances." Reginald's smile widened, clearly believing she was walking directly into his trap. "How unfortunate for you, to discover such manipulation only now, standing here before the entire county." "Oh, I did not discover it only now," Ilara said, and something in her tone made his smile falter slightly. "I discovered it nearly 3 weeks ago, when my brother uncovered signed statements from 3 separate merchants, each one confirming they were pressured to abandon our shop by a man calling in old family debts, a man named Reginald Thorne." The room erupted into murmurs, guests turning toward each other in shocked confusion, and Reginald's carefully composed expression cracked visibly for the first time. "That is a baseless accusation," he said, though his voice carried less confidence than before. "It is not baseless at all," Alistair said, stepping forward to stand beside his wife, his voice hard with barely restrained anger. "We have written statements, signed and witnessed, along with correspondence, proving you personally covered the debts you encouraged merchants to call in early. You engineered my wife's family's ruin, deliberately, methodically, purely to leave her vulnerable enough to serve your own purposes, Colin stepped forward from where he had been waiting near the edge of the crowd, carrying a leather folder that he handed directly to Alistair. "The evidence is all here," he said, his young voice carrying clearly, despite his nervousness, at addressing such a crowded room. "Every statement, every piece of correspondence, ready for any magistrate who wishes to examine it." Reginald's eyes darted toward Vivian, seeking support, but she had already begun quietly retreating toward the edge of the room, unwilling to be associated too closely with accusations now unfolding in such damning public detail. "This is preposterous," Reginald said, though his voice had lost all its earlier confidence. "Family debts are complicated matters. I merely called in what was rightfully owed to me." "You called in debts specifically to destroy a family's livelihood," Alistair said, his voice carrying through the silent room with absolute authority. "You calculated, correctly as it turned out, that their desperation might eventually benefit you, though I doubt even you anticipated the marriage that ultimately resulted. Regardless, your cruelty is documented, witnessed, and now known to everyone in this room." Murmurs of disapproval spread through the crowd, guests who had arrived hoping to witness scandal, now finding themselves witnessing something entirely different. A public reckoning that left Reginald exposed rather than Alara diminished. Several guests began drawing away from him visibly, their earlier curiosity replaced by open disapproval. "You will not simply humiliate me before the entire county without consequence," Reginald said, his composure finally breaking entirely, desperation creeping into his voice. "The consequences are entirely your own creation," Alistair replied evenly. "I am formally removing you from any claim to this family's estate or resources, effective immediately. The evidence Colin has gathered will be presented to the appropriate magistrate, and you will answer for your actions through proper legal channels. Whatever happens beyond this room is now entirely in your own hands, shaped by choices you made long before tonight." Reginald looked around the room, searching for some ally, some sympathetic face among the crowd, and found none. Even Vivian had positioned herself carefully at a distance, her expression carefully neutral, clearly calculating how best to distance herself from a scheme that had collapsed so publicly and so completely. Without another word, Reginald turned and strode from the ballroom, his footsteps echoing against sudden silence as guests parted to let him pass, no one moving to comfort or accompany him. The heavy front doors closed behind him with a sound that seemed to carry through the entire manor, marking a decisive end to the threat that had shadowed Alara's marriage since her earliest days at Thorn Manor. For a long moment after his departure, the ballroom remained quiet, guests absorbing what they had just witnessed. Then, slowly, conversation began returning, quieter than before, filled with a new kind of respect, as guests turned toward Alara with expressions considerably warmer than the curious skepticism she had faced earlier in the evening. Alistair turned to her, taking both her hands in his expression carrying an emotion far deeper than simple relief at Reginald's public defeat. "You handled that with more grace than I could have managed alone," he said quietly, for her ears only, despite the crowd surrounding them. "I am endlessly grateful I found you that night, whatever manipulated circumstances brought us together in the first place." "We handled it together," Alara corrected gently, "just as we will handle whatever comes next." The orchestra, sensing the shifting mood, began playing again, and Alistair drew her toward the center of the ballroom floor, other couples joining them as normal conversation and dancing gradually resumed around the edges of what had just transpired. As they moved together through the familiar steps, Alistair pulled her slightly closer than formal dancing strictly required. "I made you a promise once," he said quietly, his eyes holding hers steadily as they moved across the floor, "that I would never lie to you, that I would always give you complete honesty, regardless of how difficult that honesty might prove. You have kept that promise," Alara said, "even when it was uncomfortable, even when it required admitting things you would rather have kept hidden." "I want to make you another promise now," Alistair continued, "not out of desperation or urgent necessity, but freely, because it is genuinely what I want. I love you, Alara, not as a convenient solution to an inheritance crisis, not simply as a woman who agreed to marry a desperate stranger, but as the person who taught me that honesty, however difficult, always creates stronger foundations than comfortable silence ever could." Alara felt her breath catch, the weight of his words settling over her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the ballroom's countless candles. "I did not expect to fall in love with a desperate duke who pounded on my door at midnight," she admitted, a smile finally breaking through her carefully maintained composure. "But I find myself grateful, beyond measure, that fortune, however manipulated by cruel intentions, still led you to my door that particular night." "Then let me ask you properly," Alistair said, stopping their dance entirely, drawing her hands to his chest as guests around them continued their own celebrations, giving the couple at the center of the room a respectful, curious space. "Not as a desperate stranger requiring an immediate solution, but as a man who has come to love you completely. Will you continue this marriage with me, not as a bargain born of midnight desperation, but as a genuine choice, freely made?" "Yes," Elara said, her voice steady with certainty despite the tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes. "Freely and completely, yes." The kiss that followed was witnessed by the entire assembled county, drawing warm applause from guests who had arrived that evening expecting scandal, and instead, discovered something considerably more moving, a genuine love story, unfolding from the most unlikely of beginnings. Colin, watching from the edge of the ballroom, felt tears of his own gathering, relief and joy overwhelming the anxiety he had carried since that first strange midnight when his sister had returned home announcing her sudden marriage to a stranger. Later that same evening, once the dancing had resumed its natural rhythm and most guests had returned their attention to celebration rather than scandal, Elara found herself approached by an older woman she did not recognize, silver-haired and elegantly dressed, who introduced herself as Lady Harmon, a distant cousin of Alistair's late grandfather. "I knew your husband's grandfather well," the woman said, studying Elara with curious, kind eyes. "He was a shrewd man, difficult to fool, and even more difficult to impress. I imagine he would have approved of you rather strongly, my dear, watching how you handled that dreadful business with Reginald tonight." "Thank you," Elara said, genuinely touched by the sentiment, "though I confess, I did very little beyond simply telling the truth." "Simply telling the truth," Lady Harmon repeated, a small smile crossing her weathered features, "is rarely as simple as people imagine, particularly when the truth threatens to expose someone else's carefully constructed lies. You did more than merely speak honestly tonight, Duchess. You demonstrated exactly the kind of courage this family has needed for generations." The compliment settled warmly in Elara's chest, and she found herself, for the first time since arriving at the manor weeks earlier, feeling genuinely fully accepted by the world she had married into, not merely tolerated as a curious anomaly, but respected as someone who belonged. As the evening wound toward its close, Elara caught sight of Vivian near the ballroom's edge, watching the celebration with an expression that mixed bitterness and something almost like grudging respect. Their eyes met briefly across the crowded room, and for a moment, Elara considered approaching her, offering some words that might ease the obvious sting of the evening's events. But Vivian looked away first, gathering her shawl and slipping quietly toward the exit, choosing pride over any reconciliation that might have softened her retreat. Elara let her go without pursuit, understanding that some bridges, once burned by cruelty and manipulation, were not hers to rebuild. In the weeks that followed, Reginald faced formal legal proceedings for his deliberate destruction of the Winters family shop, ultimately losing whatever remained of his claims to the family estate entirely. Vivienne, her reputation damaged by association with the failed scheme, quietly withdrew from county society, her ambitions for reclaiming Alistair's affection permanently extinguished by her own poor choice of allies. Elara used a portion of the estate's resources to rebuild her family's shop, transforming it into a thriving business that employed several villagers who had fallen on hard times themselves, understanding intimately the desperation such circumstances could create. Colin returned to his studies, secure now in his future, and visited the manor regularly, gradually forming a genuine friendship with the brother-in-law he had initially viewed with such suspicion. Alistair and Elara's marriage, which had begun as a desperate midnight bargain, sealed by an unusual promise, grew steadily into something neither of them had anticipated that first frantic night. They faced difficult conversations honestly, even when honesty proved uncomfortable, understanding that the strength of their bond depended entirely on the trust they had worked so carefully to build between them. Years later, When their own children asked how their parents had first met, Ilara would tell them the story exactly as it happened. The desperate midnight knock, the strange promise she had demanded before agreeing to marry a stranger, the difficult truths they had both learned to share freely rather than withhold out of misguided protection. And she would always end the story the same way, reminding her children that the foundation of any lasting love was not grand gestures or convenient circumstances, but simple, consistent honesty, freely given, even when the truth proved difficult to speak aloud. "Your father promised me honesty that first night," she would say, smiling at the memory of a desperate duke pounding on her door in the darkness. "And he has kept that promise every single day since, through difficulty and joy alike. That promise, more than anything else, is what transformed a desperate bargain into a genuine love, strong enough to last a lifetime." Alistair, listening from the doorway during these familiar retellings, would often add his own small addition to the story, reminding their children that their mother had never once let him retreat into comfortable silence, even during the rare disagreements every marriage eventually faced. "She taught me that love without honesty is merely a pleasant illusion," he would say, "and that real love requires the courage to speak difficult truths, even when silence would be considerably easier." The manor itself changed under Ilara's careful stewardship over the following years, its formal distance softening into genuine warmth. The staff who had once regarded her with cautious suspicion came to view her with deep affection, and Mrs. Pemberton often remarked, in later years, that the manor had never felt more like a true home than it did once the Duchess arrived and began quietly reshaping its rhythms around kindness, rather than formality alone. Colin eventually established his own successful trade business, built partly on connections he first made during those anxious weeks investigating Reginald's schemes, and he remained close with his sister and her family throughout his life, visiting often enough that the manor's staff came to know him as fondly as they knew Alistair himself. As for the promise that had begun everything, the one whispered in a dark shop doorway, by a frightened but determined young woman to a desperate stranger, it remained the quiet foundation beneath everything that followed. Not every truth Alistair and Ilara shared across the following years was easy to hear. There were disagreements, worries, and difficult seasons, as any genuine marriage inevitably faces, but never again did either of them retreat into comfortable silence, when honesty, however difficult, was truly what the moment required. And that, more than the grand ballrooms, or the ancient title, or the vast estate stretching across the county, became the true inheritance Ilara and Alistair eventually passed on to their own children. The understanding that real love is built not on convenient comfort, but on the harder, steadier ground of truth, freely spoken and faithfully kept.